Thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. It's a pleasure to be with you even virtually, and thank you to the organizers and participants for your patience with having a virtual presentation. I'm actually 6 hours behind you and probably 10,000 miles away in Grenada, which is a small island, part of one of the small island developing states in the Caribbean region. So I want to start with a short anecdote. A colleague of mine who was a member of the New York State Medical Association told me a story about going to a meeting of the association, and one of her colleagues at some point stood up, we'll call that person Dr. Smith, and said, well, we need to be concerned about the health effects of fracking. And this was quite some years back. And the story was that everybody sort of took interest and said, yeah, that's a kind of moved on. And almost every month, Dr. Smith would stand up and say something else about the health impacts of fracking. And it got to a point where the colleagues in the meeting would sort of roll their eyes, oh, here we go again. And yet after perhaps 2 or more years of this, somehow the idea began to get some traction with the group. And ultimately that society was among the very first to take a stand in the United States in opposition to fracking. So I want to come back to that story a little bit later on when we talk about how bioethics can help mitigate emissions, but first I want to explain why they should. I don't know how many bioethicists are in the audience. I know there are a lot of scientists, and I very greatly value this opportunity to talk across disciplines, which is something that doesn't happen often enough about any topic, let alone bioethics or climate change. So to start with why bioethics should promote environmental sustainability, we need to take a quick look at how we define bioethics. What's its history and function? Fundamentally, it's to help and explore and help resolve ethical concerns and dilemmas and uncertainties involving human health. At least that's the way it's widely conceived of today by bioethicists and others. Historically, it wasn't focused exclusively on humans, it also encompassed other living things. And that's something that has been lost, although there are some of us who are trying to bring it back. So bioethics, another reason is that probably most of you, certainly health professionals who are participating, are very much aware of the role of autonomy in medicine and in healthcare. And bioethics was hugely influential in making a change from what was once all over the world a very paternalistic approach to medicine. The standard was do what the doctor says, the doctor knows best, the doctor doesn't have to tell the truth to the patient about their condition if they think it's going to harm the patient to know. And that has changed across much of the world, and even where it hasn't changed explicitly through norms, policies, and regulations, at least the physicians and other health professionals in those locations are very much aware of autonomy and are more sensitive to it. And so this is a positive thing for human research subjects and for patient care. And there's a lot of actual evidence documenting that reality. However, there's a problem in that bioethics has really failed to understand or express to others that autonomy is only one part of a bigger principle, the principle of respect for persons, and that as individuals, our ability to interact, to choose for ourselves, the choices that we have to us, that we're the opportunities for health or anything else, really are very determined by our environments, including our social and human interactions. So bioethics has really gotten lost in focusing on a very United States-oriented conception of autonomy as right. It's my right. And although that was never the intention, and many bioethicists would say that that's not what they believe or teach, that's the way the consumer of autonomy, the patients and other health professionals and the public at large, tends to think of autonomy as, well, it's my right to choose. But that's really not what it's about. So bioethics has really failed in making that clear, and I'll talk about why that's important for climate change. Some of you are perhaps familiar with the WHO's determinants of health, widely used and understood in healthcare, and those are centered on socioeconomic environments and then physical environments. But for the purposes of climate change and for bioethics, it makes a lot more sense, in my view, to talk about social environments and physical environments. So social environments don't exist in isolation. They exist in physical locations and structures and buildings and parks in various countries. They also exist virtually in social media and other ways. But I think you could argue that virtual social media type relationships are occurring in a built environment, because we're in built environments and we built the technology to make it happen. So the point being that environments, you can't really separate, I don't think, the social from the physical. So bioethics, again, widely coming out of the United States and Canada as well, is widely perceived as being about medical ethics and research ethics, when in fact, historically, it was much broader. And even today, it's actually much broader with the subspecialties like public health ethics and neuroethics and what's called genetics, et cetera. And I want to briefly mention global bioethics, because that was an early form of bioethics. And in 1980s, Dan Rensselaer-Potter published a very well-known book by the title Global Bioethics, where bioethics was applied to health, well-being, and survival of humans in the context of the global environment. So in the context of different countries, of the planet itself. And the idea was, at least some of the things he talked about were things like nuclear war, global warming, what he called global warming then, and global population growth. These were certainly big issues in the 1980s. They were actually issues in the 1960s, and they've only gotten worse, sadly. So my approach to climate change is that it's a global problem and it's an ethical problem. It's a global bioethics problem. But what's really interesting and hopefully helpful is to think about the impacts and consequences in different contexts, in different environments. So I actually have a chapter in my book that deals with Arctic and small island developing states. Of course, there are obvious differences in these regions, but there are actually a lot of interesting similarities. So coming from some of the IPCC reports, and then I actually collaborated on a study which we published contrasting two Caribbean small island developing states. One of them was more developed, more populous than the other. And we found differences between them in terms of perceptions of health professionals about the health impacts of climate change on their populations. And that was not surprising. Doing that work led me to certain reviews, and coming out of that work is some of this work from the IPCC. So the similarities relative to other regions of the world is that they're both remote, they're both relatively undeveloped, and in today's world, they've become heavily reliant on imported goods and services, things like supermarkets, which of course undermine their ability to be self-sustaining in traditional ways of feeding themselves, and also are very expensive. Additionally, other countries as well, but relative to most, these areas have really extensive coastal areas, and they're very low lying. And along these coastal areas tends to be a lot of infrastructure, roads, buildings for ports or transportation, sometimes industries, factories, and also housing. So these are really very valuable coastal areas. And of course, that makes them very much more vulnerable to sea level rise, to storm surges or sea surges, which we have a lot in the Caribbean, and certainly to any form of extreme weather because you're very exposed. And you can see in the pictures on the left, on the right, remarkably, just this week, the worst storm to hit Alaska in decades, and we're seeing a roof there floating in water, which is presumably come up pretty high to close to the bottom of the bridge. At the same time, what looks like a very expensive house floating in the floodwaters of Hurricane Fiona in Puerto Rico. So very different types of climates and cultures and histories and traditions, but also very similar impacts, at least from climate change in this sense. The repercussions and the recovery are challenging in different ways, given the context they're in. And at the same time, we're seeing in Washington State, this picture was published just yesterday, I think it was, and this is Air Quality Index, an opinion piece by someone who took their family on the first holiday since the pandemic and found that the air quality was higher than was safe and couldn't let their very young children go outside to play. So I think we all know that this is a real problem, and hopefully the rest of the world is catching on, but are we doing enough? Are we doing enough quickly enough? To kind of wrap up on this slide, the similarities fundamentally are that these regions have very little voice in the world, little economic and political influence for the reasons above, and they also are much more vulnerable to emissions. And of course, emissions then are increasing warming, they're increasing the extreme weather, vector-borne diseases, and that's very interesting because there's a lot of evidence done about how the vectors themselves are moving north. If you're in the tropical areas, you're seeing new vectors and diseases coming into areas that didn't exist. Similarly, in the northern areas, although the vectors and the diseases differ with location. So it's fair to say that emissions reflect failed policies, and there's some small amount of literature looking at this. And there is a forthcoming special issue of the journal Perspectives in Biology and Medicine, which looks at this topic, not specifically about climate change and emissions, but about failed policies in general and bioethics responses. And so some of my comments today will be in a paper in that issue. Anyway, I think it's a very useful lens to look at what we're doing. It's really at the policy level that we need to be focusing. So policy benefits include economic growth and political gain for countries, for corporations, for industries. And you're all, I'm sure, very familiar with the chains of the high percentages of emissions that are produced by fossil fuels, mining, and industrial agriculture. And the benefits are disproportionately small for low resource countries and communities. So this then raises questions about justice. And I know I heard someone ask a question earlier about environmental justice. So justice is clearly an important issue for climate change and climate ethics and bioethics, because we're seeing abundant benefits for some other benefits for others and very few benefits for still others. There's a lot of work these days about social structures and how they unjustly cause harms and worsen harms. James Dwyer has written about how, in the case of climate change, it's forcing people to become environmental migrants. Adaptation, there's no way we can not try to adapt, take adaptive responses, and those adaptations have to vary with the location and the need, obviously. But they require priority setting, and that usually means there's winners and losers, and that usually means there's more injustices. So mitigation to carbon neutrality, in my view, is really essential, and bioethics is doing a huge disservice by not trying to explain this point to people, because adaptation there's just no way that we can indefinitely delay or manage what's happening in the world in terms of the accumulating emissions. So Keisha Ray recently wrote about environmental justice and structural injustice, and in the United States, it's neighborhoods of color where we often locate our landfills and toxin releasing industries, and that's very well documented. So she wrote about it from a bioethics perspective. And that, it reminds us that things we've seen today with the Flint, Michigan water crisis, which has persisted for years, although there's a lot of work trying to improve it, and a lot has been improved. Things that happened with Hurricane Katrina, and numerous examples like that. So that, again, it's a justice issue. So James Dwyer wrote recently about the question of responsibilities. And he said, why should I and people like me take responsibility for this? We don't condone this. We didn't make it happen. Why should we take any responsibility? And he answers that with the view that my relationship to the problem and the structures that influence it give me a shared responsibility. So even though it's not me that caused the problem, I do benefit from the system. I have a relationship to the structures, the social structures and other structures that make this happen. So I share in the responsibility to change those structures that are disadvantaging people unfairly. And he goes on in his paper to argue that the more I'm privileged by unjust structures that shape the problem, the more responsibility I should take. So in a nutshell, why do bioethics have a responsibility to engage in promoting environmental sustainability? We contribute to and benefit from the problem. We, particularly in bioethics, claim to promote and value justice, health, and well-being. Andrew Jameton wrote some years ago about climate-related moral distress in health professionals for all of these very reasons, and noted that activism helps to relieve or alleviate some of that moral distress. The healthcare industry is very interesting. It employs bioethicists, and obviously many professions. And the healthcare industry itself, there's a lot of work these days about that and how it is a significant emitter of emissions. And that's beginning to change. Sadly, no thanks to bioethics, primarily due to physicians and other health professionals who have nudged the industry and said, it's somewhat hypocritical. Here we are promoting health at the same time that we're worsening it indirectly by being emitters when we don't have to emit as much. We can be more environmentally sustainable. And in the UK, there's immense progress with the NHS. In the United States, there are a couple of very impressive changes through the Gunderson Health System, Kaiser Permanente, and others. So bioethicists, like scientists and other academicians, have opportunities, have expertise and influence. We can make this case and we can increase the impact simply because of who we are and our expertise and influence. So generally we teach, we advocate for patients, We conduct our own research and scholarly work. We do ethical reviews of research. We inform policymakers who are good at communicating complex ideas to people from a diverse walk of backgrounds. And it's important that we start to think about how we do begin to inform more about the need for environmental sustainability. And I would say that a question that hangs with me, or a thought that hangs with me always, is how explicit or how subtle should we be? And the answer is that we don't really know the outcomes of our actions and our efforts. So it's hard to answer that. It's a subjective question. But in my experience, I would say subtle is more widely accepted by people, causing them to begin to think peripherally to climate issues rather than being more explicit. Okay, so how can we help mitigate emissions? One thing we can do that many bioethicists have talked about, not just in the context of climate change, is using our voices when we're informing policymakers and administrators to draw attention to this. And quoting another physician bioethicist, Joseph Benz, recently, who talked about how bioethics really has not focused on these kinds of issues, and he's had a very long and illustrious career, and he reflects that he wishes he had thought more about this earlier in his career. And he talks about two former presidents of the Hastings Center, bioethicists, sadly deceased, Dan Callahan, who was concerned about putting too much faith in technology, things like carbon capture. Will it ever be possible? Maybe. Will it ever be possible on the scale that it needs to be to really make a difference? Maybe. Can we predict the potential damages and losses while we wait for that to happen, or once it does happen? Not really. So that's a problem. And similarly, Strong Donnelly, we shouldn't be pitting technology against nature, and often things like wetland restoration in the case of Hurricane Katrina will be better and longer lasting than building levees. So we can also do research in our own areas, turning a little bit reflective towards environments. There are two really interesting papers in bioethics recently that aren't focused on climate change or emissions, but do have a lot to say about them. One deals with built environments, and one deals with genomics. So who would have thought people in those areas would have begun to engage with these issues? And I'm very pleased that they are. And I think there's so much more that we in bioethics should be doing other than writing about autonomy and whether it's being met in certain locations or conditions and how to better meet it. Research ethics, likewise, there are people talking, at least if not writing, about should we be thinking about environmental sustainability and damages to environments when we're considering the social value of research, or when we're considering the priorities, our research priorities. Similarly, we can encourage funders and editors, bioethics societies to focus on releasing calls for research, publication, and conferences dealing with these issues in bioethics. Sadly, the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities, which I was a member for a long time, has been very remiss and reluctant to respond other than lip service to calls from members and its environmental working group or interest group to even consider the sustainability of its conferences. Prior to COVID-19, there were efforts over many years. I was part of some of them, certainly not all, not the original ones. And it falls on deaf ears that we should consider having our conferences be a little bit more eco-friendly. So other things we can do, we can host and attend interdisciplinary events for all range of different topics. We can, One Health, which was mentioned in the earlier talk, very valuable topic for doing that. We can go to talks like that and just ask a question about ethics or about sustainability. And we can certainly teach in so many different ways, reminding people when we focus on autonomy that it's not just about the individual and their freedom or right to choose. It's really about their relationships that enable them to choose. So coming back to the story I told you at the beginning, it's repetition. You know, we may not get it the first time, we may not get it for a few years, but we got to keep trying, and that's all we can do. So I really recommend that. And I think these ideas not only are valuable for bioethics, but for everyone who's situated like me, as Dwyer would say, who's educated, who's relatively well off from a relatively wealthy country. And that's in addition to the things that we can just do as average citizens, joining groups and such, watching, reducing our own energy and waste. So in conclusion, the health impacts of emissions are increasing, they're unfair, they're worsened by structural injustices, hence bioethics have some responsibility to respond. We can do so very easily in very small, subtle ways, just by beginning to integrate the topics into their work. I wish more of us would do so, and I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Cheryl, for a great talk and a clear talk. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Cheryl. This is Sigurður. We've been in contact over the email. So thank you. This was very inspiring, and I do bioethics myself, so I took the message really much at heart. And I think I agree with everything you said, but it got me wondering, to what extent is this, is your argument, does it rely on the topics and contents of bioethics versus just any kind of professional endeavor? So, I mean, could you generalize your argument so that it applies to anyone who is in any kind of position for action?
Yes, I absolutely think that this could be generalized. And I think James Dwyer's effort there, using the language "and people situated like me," it certainly generalizes for him, generalizing to all bioethicists, but I think it also generalizes, again, much more broadly. The intriguing thing is that as healthcare institutions slowly, way too slowly, begin to become more environmentally sustainable, bioethics hasn't followed suit and hasn't nudged that. And the importance of that is that the healthcare industry is all about promoting health, and to do so at using unnecessary emissions. Admittedly, we need some emissions until we can find the carbon neutral approach, but we can get there. The NHS has pledged to get there by 2040, which is a remarkable ambition, and claims to be on track to get there, to get 80% there by 2030. The Gunderson health system in Wisconsin, which is a relatively small system, is carbon neutral, and not through purchasing carbon caps and such, but actually through policies that it have effect, the cleaning supplies that it uses, supply chains for foods, for medications, etc. And so I think this can generalize to anyone, yes, particularly those of us from wealthy countries, those of us who are educated, those of us who earn a decent living. But I think those who work in healthcare and those who work in bioethics have a particular role to play and a particular responsibility, because that's what we do supposedly, is to promote and protect health. And if we're undermining that with our emissions production, that is not right. So thank you very much, Sigurd, for that question.
Hello, I'm Miki Gjerris. I'm a bioethicist as well. We seem to have gathered in this corner of the room for some reason. I'm from the University of Copenhagen. A couple of years ago, a Danish sociologist, Rasmus Willig, and a Norwegian philosopher, Jon Vetlesen, wrote a book together called What Should We Answer? What should we answer our children when they come and ask us why we didn't do anything? And in that book, they claim that any person working in academia who doesn't work to fight climate change is failing to live up to their academic responsibility. And you pointed to some areas where you thought bioethicists could do some things and should do some things, but they actually take it even further and say, if you do not engage in political activism, basically glue yourself to an airport entrance, you have failed your responsibility as an academic. How do you look at those sort of wider claims of what is the responsibility of bioethicists in this situation?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not familiar with the book, and it's an interesting idea. The reality is that with advocacy and political activism, in principle, yes, I agree. We all have a role to play in that. But in reality, we can't predict what the outcome is going to be, right? You can't predict the outcome of gluing yourself to the airport entrance. And many of us fly still, maybe less than we once did, maybe seldom, but we still do for all sorts of reasons and legitimate reasons. You know, I have often felt that the emphasis on is a little bit of a digression, but the emphasis on the individual consumer not to fly. Why are we not putting the emphasis on the airlines and the airports and the governments that regulate them to make flying more environmentally sustainable? Because it certainly could be, it maybe not zero carbon neutral, but it could certainly be more sustainable. But to answer your question more specifically, I think the reality is that we don't know the result of our action. It's that question of, do we be explicit? Do we be loud? Or will we have a better impact if we're quiet and subtle? It's about sort of like in personal relationships, we pick our battles, we choose the right timing, we think about the approach that's going to make a difference. Certainly, if you want to get attention, yes, you can be loud and you can glue yourself to the airport entrance, but will that make a difference? I don't know. I mean, look at Greta Thunberg, who's a wonderful example. A child when she began, and you know, she just quietly went and sat on the steps, and that has had immense impact on the world, I would say. Not enough, obviously, but immense. So I don't fully agree with their view, but then maybe they wrote it simply to provoke even some movement. I don't know.
Hi, Cheryl. My name is Ellen, and I study bioethics here at Umeå University. I wanted to ask you what other questions you think that bioethicists should further investigate related to climate change, because you speak a lot about autonomy and that being relational to environment. Are there other kind of, questions that you think should be investigated by bioethicists when it comes to this theme?
That's a really interesting question, and it's kind of challenging. There has been a fair amount of work on what's called relational autonomy. Bruce Jennings has done a lot of that, a lot of the feminist bioethicists prior to him, trying to express the views that the underlying theory to make those views more, I suppose, palatable, help them gain traction. So I don't think it's so much work in terms of research on the topic as much as helping people to understand, sort of reconceptualizing the issues that we're looking at. So when we're doing clinical ethics consultations, which certainly in North America is a huge employer of bioethicists, that those people not think about so much about protecting the individual's autonomy, but begin to think about their autonomy in a broader sense in terms of environments and relationships and social structures and that sort of thing. What I do think is more helpful is to whatever topic one is studying, to bring in an environmental component. That's where I think we're really remiss. So that's why I highlight the recent papers about the built environment in bioethics, which is not a topic that bioethics often covers or engages in. And the fact that they went to that and then also brought in climate change about it. Now, bioethics does a lot on genetics, but has not, the paper I mentioned with that really looked at environmental, built environments, climate change, and all of that sort of thing on, and social structures on genetics. So it's being creative, thinking about environmental implications and connections to whatever topic we're working on. I think that's something that we should be doing.
Hi, Cheryl. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I just wondered if you had any perspective on the idea of decolonizing the conceptual field of bioethics as well.
So that's also a very difficult question. It's not something that I know a lot about. Other than sort of as an educated person, I've not studied it or investigated it, but you know, I know something. I live in Grenada, which is a Commonwealth country. Our neighbor is Barbados, which was until very recently a Commonwealth country. That's perhaps our nearest neighbor. Jamaica to the north of us is debating leaving the Commonwealth, and we've just seen the death of Queen Elizabeth. And it has made me think about this. And because of where I've lived for so many decades, really, I've seen the value. There's no question about the colonial history and the wrongs. That's well documented, and the responses to it today are totally understandable and supportable in many ways. However, the Commonwealth today, I think, and this is a personal view, has immense value in really capacity building for low resource countries, bringing standards higher in so many ways that the average person doesn't see, that I suppose because I live in such a place, I see the results. Standards in terms of education, in terms of sports and fitness, etc. So I don't have anything really wise to say about decolonization other than the fact that it's so very complicated.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? No. Yeah. One more question.
Hi, very interesting talk. Thank you very much for that. My question is regarding when you talked about responsibility and that it depends upon the degree of privilege. Could you perhaps more in depth go down what you mean by that? Because privilege can be very wide, has wide implications, social, ethnical, perhaps economically, and so on, geographically as well. Could you talk a little bit more about what you mean by it?
Yeah, so actually I was quoting James Dwyer, who's written a lot about that, but there's a lot of work in bioethics about this idea of responsibility and what is it that makes someone more or less responsible for something. When should we take action? And one of the considerations is, will we be able to make a difference? You know, and so those of us who are placed in positions of authority or in positions where people listen to us, at least often or sometimes, have a greater responsibility to take action. Those of us who are in proximity to something, if we're a health professional and we're working in the health field, we have more of a responsibility. But the idea of privilege is generally, I suppose, that if you think, I think about it then, because again, I've lived and traveled in wealthy countries, obviously, much of my life, but I've lived and worked in Grenada, which is not a wealthy country, for decades. And so I have a foot in both doors. And people who have not traveled, I mean, there's an immense diversity. Grenada is not like remote parts of an African country where people are completely living in poverty. But those of us, even in poor communities in wealthy countries, I think live a more privileged life in many ways than those who live in a low resource country, in that they have access to, for example, maybe Wi-Fi, to food, to information, and certainly our ability to access those things and learn from them and influenced by them, even in a wealthy country, ranges immensely from those who have a lot to those who have a very little. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, so if not further questions, I would like to thank you again for an inspiring talk. Thank you, Cheryl. On the behalf of NC Bio, I would like to thank all the speakers today, or our three sessions. I would like to thank the audience, both here in Umeå and online. And tomorrow we will start at 9 o'clock sharp. Andri Snær Magnusson will start tomorrow. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all again tomorrow.